Hello, my name is Melina Smith, and I will be presenting today on behalf of Region 360 to discuss the link between climate justice and food insecurity in Central America, focusing on Guatemala. I will provide context about the current food insecurity conditions, how climate change related weather events are exacerbating this issue, and how indigenous and rural communities are being disproportionately affected. I will then discuss policy and programs addressing this crisis and how a climate justice approach could contribute to improved progress. Regional context. Guatemala is situated in northern Central America and is a part of an area known as the Northern Triangle, consisting of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. We will be speaking to the Northern Triangle today, but we will be focusing on Guatemala, specifically the region known as the Western Highlands, highlighted here in yellow. The demographics of this country are as follows. At 16.6 million people, Guatemala is the most populous country in Central America and has the largest indigenous population than any other nation in the Western Hemisphere. Census data shows that approximately 41 to 45% of the total population is indigenous. However, other estimates predict that closer to 60% of the total population is indigenous. The Western Highlands are the mountainous region stretching from Antigua, Guatemala to the border of Mexico. The population in the highlands is predominantly indigenous, and people's livelihoods are almost entirely agrarian, with the economy characterized by subsistence farming systems. The highlands are part of a larger rural and agriculturally dependent region in Central America known as the Dry Corridor. The Dry Corridor, highlighted in orange on the map, is a large, dry tropical rainforest that extends through Central America and is highly susceptible to extreme weather. Climate and food insecurity. Fluctuating atmosphere-ocean circulation patterns in the East Equatorial Pacific, known as the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO cycle, has caused extreme and unpredictable drought and flooding cycles in the Dry Corridor, which have been exacerbated by a rapidly changing global climate. Guatemala is among the top 10 countries in the world most susceptible to climate change and the fourth most exposed to natural disasters in the region. Due to its location in the country, the Western Highlands bear the brunt of this extreme weather. Food insecurity. Subsistence farmers and indigenous peoples, an overwhelming majority of population in the highlands, are acutely vulnerable to extreme weather events and its effects on agricultural production. For the fifth consecutive year, extended dry spells and torrential rains have ravaged maize and bean crops, leaving those whose livelihoods are linked to agriculture without crops to eat or sell, contributing to the high rates of food insecurity. Due to a prolonged El Niño event, the region is currently experiencing the worst dry cropping season in 35 years that has reduced harvests or completely destroyed staple crops. This has also caused poor soil conditions and degraded agricultural lands. Guatemala has the fourth highest rate of malnutrition in the world and the highest in Latin America. Approximately 47% of the children under 5 experience stunting due to chronic malnutrition. However, national stunting data had significant disparities in the country, with stunting and chronic malnutrition reaching around 70% in indigenous areas in the Western Highlands. Before we define climate justice, it is important to review the different interpretations of justice as it pertains to this research. European notions of justice can be traced back to Greek philosophy and are characterized by what is lawful and fair, with fairness involving equitable distributions and the correction of what is inequitable. In this view, justice in the society is equality and proportion in the enjoyment of values. Mesoamerican and Mayan notions of justice. Mesoamerica is a historical region extending from central Mexico to Central America and was home to some of our great civilizations, including the Olmec, Aztec, Zapotec, and the Maya, amongst many others. As the majority of the indigenous population in Guatemala are of Mayan descent, we will focus on Maya notions of justice, keeping in mind that there are approximately 21 different Maya communities and approximately 26 different Maya languages, and ideologies and customs may vary throughout. However, they share their Maya ancestry. Historically, the Maya have been underserved or misrepresented by government-led judicial processes, giving rise to a movement of self-governance amongst the Maya people. This movement has developed a community-driven legal framework and demands for judicial processes. Central to the idea of making just decisions and therefore achieving justice is the concept of consultation. According to this idea, indigenous people have the right to receive consultation and to provide consent whenever government actions may have a direct impact on their rights or interests. And this is perceived to be a fundamental right. Central to the Maya cosmovision is the idea of maintaining balance and harmony. Through a community-driven process of consultation, consent, and consensus, there can be more of a balance in decision-making when addressing crises such as climate justice and food insecurity. What is climate justice? The climate justice movement aims to view climate change as more than an environmental issue affecting our physical environment, but also as an issue of human rights, and acknowledges that those suffering the greatest burdens from climate change are those that are least responsible for our changing climate. Climate justice efforts protect the rights of the world's most vulnerable and demand a meaningful, systematic transformation as a means to address the root causes of climate change and its disproportionate effects on vulnerable communities. Climate justice and food insecurity. Here we will discuss how climate justice-related issues such as poverty and the marginalization of communities have contributed to food insecurity and malnutrition. For a middle-income country, the rates of poverty in Guatemala are disproportionate to the country's rate of growth and GDP. The graph shows the disparities in the rates of poverty between indigenous populations in yellow and non-indigenous populations in teal. As you can see, indigenous populations suffer from poverty at a much higher rate. These high rates of poverty leave little room for adaptation if a season's worth of crops are wiped out due to a prolonged drought or unexpected flood, contributing to the high rates of food scarcity. Land distribution and tenure. The largest 2% of commercial farms own 57% of the country's agricultural land, while 92% of small farms share only 22% of the country's agricultural land. The graph on the left reflects these statistics. The lack of access to land has left already vulnerable communities highly susceptible to displacement as extreme weather causes many places to be less habitable. Land tenure insecurity. Due to a deficit in adopted legislation for the adjudication of the rights of indigenous peoples to own their lands, many are subject to land tenure insecurity, which leaves many rural and indigenous communities vulnerable in the face of competing interests to habitable and harvestable land, which perpetuates the rates of poverty and malnutrition. Policy and progress. Our research into policies, programs, and grassroots movements that are addressing food insecurity in the Western Highlands of Guatemala are ongoing. The next few slides will discuss our findings so far. We will measure Guatemala's advancements towards addressing food insecurity by monitoring its progress towards meeting UN Sustainable Development Goal indicators. There are two major national and international goals aimed at reducing chronic malnutrition and stunting in children. The UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals are a global call to action to address some of the world's most pressing issues. Number 2 on the list is Zero Hunger, which aims to end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture by 2030. Guatemala's National Development Plan and the National Strategy to Prevent Chronic Malnutrition outline their priorities of reducing stunting by 10% by 2020 and by 24% by 2032. In the past decade, there have been national multi-sectoral nutrition policies developed to accelerate the reduction of malnutrition. International aid from USAID, World Bank, and the EU have all invested thousands of dollars to aid the country in meeting SDG 2 nutrition goals. However, despite these efforts, progress has fallen short of meeting national and international goals. The following are progress highlights over the past 10 years of national and international initiatives. 249,000 children under 5 have been reached with nutrition and intervention. $16.8 million in agricultural sales have been generated by small farms who were reached by USAID's Feed the Future. And 22,000 families have been provided with training in diverse agricultural practices. 3 major UN indicators, wasting, stunting, and undernourishment, are used to measure Guatemala's progress towards achieving the goals set forth in SDG 2. At 1.1%, Guatemala is meeting the goals for the prevalence of wasting in children under 5 years. However, at 48%, the rate of stunting is not meeting the goal for SDG 2, and this is not taking into account the high rates of stunting in indigenous communities, which hovers at around 70%. Also, at 15.6%, Guatemala is not meeting the UN's goal of prevalence of undernourishment, and this does also not take into account the higher rates of approximately 47% in indigenous communities. The number of malnutrition and stunting cases are expected to increase due to the loss of livelihoods related to the COVID-19 pandemic. More than 15,000 cases of acute malnutrition among children were reported at the end of May 2020, exceeding the total number of cases reported for all of 2019. Moving forward. In researching various analyses of these efforts, a common limiting factor has been identified: a lack of a comprehensive effort to address the structural causes to malnutrition, such as poverty, inequality, and insufficient land distribution. Most investments are given to health and food-specific interventions. While this is important, investments in an income generation to relieve poverty, investment in agricultural production, education, and plans for long-term resilience to climate change that would address underlying causes of malnutrition have received either irregular funding or none at all. Action: extend financial assistance to human investments in economic opportunity for rural and indigenous communities. A leading driver in food insecurity is the reality that many households often struggle to grow enough nutritious food due to poor soil quality, small plots of land, and low incomes. This is exacerbated by extreme and unpredictable weather patterns. Action: food assistance programs must provide families with resources such as an increased distribution of land, agricultural training, weather predicting technology, and education programs that would enable families to be better equipped to recover from natural disasters or other shocks to their livelihood. As climate change related weather events are increasingly unpredictable, communities whose livelihoods are solely supported by agrarian activities are highly susceptible to loss of food and income. Program aims at addressing food insecurity should include strategies that will provide culturally competent training and education programs for indigenous and rural communities, and skills that will enable and empower them to diversify their sources of income. Climate justice is a human rights-based approach to addressing the negative impacts of climate change. This requires policies and programs that correct the structural causes for social inequalities, which result in the livelihoods of marginalized communities being disproportionately disrupted by unpredictable weather. Due to social and economic inequalities, indigenous and rural communities in the western highlands of Guatemala are experiencing a food scarcity emergency at a much higher rate than the rest of the country. Policies and programs must employ a community-driven approach informed by processes of consultations and consent that prioritize and adhere to investment in the empowerment of these communities to be able to support themselves in the long term, have access to equitable economic opportunity, and have the appropriate tools needed to become resilient to a rapidly changing global climate. For prosperous, resilient, and self-sustaining rural and indigenous communities. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.